One evening, I stepped into my barn and found a shivering, wounded little thing curled in the hay, eyes too aware to be an animal. And as I carried it toward my house, I glanced back and saw a much larger shape standing at the tree line, watching in silence, like I'd just been chosen. My name was Thomas Smith. I was 56 years old when a stable gave me a reason to wake up in the morning again. I was a farmer, not the kind you see on postcards. No pretty white fences, no tourists buying jam, just hay, a bit of livestock, repairs that never ended, and weather that didn't give a damn about your plans. I worked with my hands, because hands don't lie. If a hinge squeaks, you grease it. If a fence sags, you reset the post. If a man's heart is broken, well, there were no tools for that. My wife, Ellen, had passed away 3 years before it all began. The illness came quietly and stayed for good. Toward the end, the house was full of sounds, medicine bottles, the trickle of water in the sink, the thud of my boots. But after the funeral, the sounds leaked out like water from a cracked bucket. Ellen was movement itself, a singing kettle, a chair sliding back, a quiet radio in the background while she folded towels. When she was gone, the house didn't feel haunted. It felt unfinished, as if someone had walked out in the middle of a sentence and never returned. Some evenings I'd sit at the kitchen table and stare at the pale oval worn into the wood across from me. It was the spot where Ellen used to rest her elbows. The table remembered her better than I did. The night I found it, I suppose, for I didn't have the words yet, started ordinarily enough. It was cold enough to make the boards in the stable crack. The sky was low and gray, the color of old pewter. It had rained earlier, leaving behind the scent of damp earth and crushed pine needles. My boots sank slightly into the mud between the porch and the yard, and the step creaked in its usual place, like an aching joint reminding you of its existence. I went out because one of the heifers was about to calve. Animals don't look at calendars, they listen to their bodies. When a cow is close, you check on her. You don't have the right to be tired. You don't have the right to grief. You just go. In my left hand, I held a flashlight. In my right, a feed scoop. The beam cut a narrow tunnel through the dark. Beyond that tunnel, there were only sounds, wind in the grass, a distant owl, the soft shifting of cattle. Reaching the stable, I stopped. Sometimes the body hears something the mind hasn't named. It wasn't a cow. I knew every sound they made, the lowing, the huffing, the scraping of hooves against wood. This sound was quieter, a soft, uneven rustling, and beneath it, just once, a sound like a breath trying not to turn into a sob. I opened the stable door slowly. The hinges complained, familiar as my own knees. The warm air inside puffed out like steam from my mouth. Dust from the hay hung in the flashlight beam like tiny stars drifting in the air. The light slid across the packed earth, scattered straw, an old cart with a flat tire. A calf raised its head. One of the cows flicked an ear. Then the light fell on the far stall where I kept the spare bales, and I gripped the flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. Something was curled in the hay. At first, my mind tried to find a mundane explanation, a stray dog, a sick coyote, someone's child, God forbid. But this figure didn't fit any shape that belonged on a farm. It was the size of a child, but the limbs were too long. The body was covered in dark, matted fur, clumped with moisture and burrs. It had its knees pressed tightly to its chest and its forearms over its head, as if bracing for a blow. I took a step closer, and it flinched so hard the hay rattled. The cows shifted uneasily. Animals know when something new enters their world. "Hey," my voice sounded raspy and unfamiliar. "It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you."
The creature raised its head just enough for me to catch one eye in the edge of the light. Dark, wide, not glassy like a deer's, not hard like a predator's. There was a consciousness in it, and something else, a fear that had a history. It didn't make a sound, it just watched me, as if deciding whether I was the last thing it would see in its life. I crouched a few feet away, trying not to corner it. The stable smelled as it always did, of hay, old boards, and that faint tang of manure that never leaves. But beneath that, there was a sharper scent, like wet leaves and something metallic. Blood, but not much. I saw its leg tucked under it wrongly, the way an animal holds a limb when it hurts too much to use. I saw fresh scratches on its arms, where pale skin showed through the fur. Out here on a farm, you learn a specific kind of mercy. You end the suffering of what cannot be saved. You heal what can be healed. You don't waste time pretending nature is kind. But this wasn't a raccoon caught in a trap. It was small, and the way it held itself, shrunk in on itself, defensive, made my chest tighten. I suddenly remembered Ellen.
Not her hands, years ago, lifting a half-drowned sparrow out of a rain barrel, wrapping it in a towel near the stove. "Everyone deserves a chance to get warm," she had said then, as if it were a simple fact. I swallowed the lump in my throat. My throat felt like it had been scraped raw. "All right," I muttered. "All right, let's try." I took off my jacket and laid it on the hay between us. I moved slowly so my gestures wouldn't look like a reach to grab. Then I stepped back and opened my palms. The creature stared at the jacket as if it might bite. I waited. Minutes in a stable at night can last an eternity. The flashlight hummed faintly. A cow exhaled. Outside, the wind slipped through the trees. Finally, the creature edged forward, trembling. It sniffed the fabric, then lowered its full weight onto it with a shaky sigh that was too human to ignore. That sound did something to me. It cracked the hard shell I'd been living in. "You can't stay here," I said softly. "Not tonight." I didn't rush it. I moved close enough to slide my arms beneath it, and when it tensed, I paused and let it see my face. "I don't do that," I told it. "I don't hurt things that can't fight back." Its gaze met mine. In that dim light, I saw the brow ridges, the shape of the cheeks. Small, but built for a different world. It shuddered once more, and then slowly, as if making a choice, it let me pick it up. It was heavier than it looked, solid muscle beneath the wet fur, warm in some places, cold in others. When I lifted it, it gave an involuntary little sound and pressed its head against my chest, as if trying to disappear into me. The night air hit my face, sharp and cold as I carried it to the house. My boots squelched in the mud. The creature's heart hammered fast against my ribs. Every step my mind raced ahead, headlights on the road, a neighbor stopping by, questions I couldn't answer. I didn't turn on the porch light. I kept the flashlight low, pointing the beam at the ground. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and the faint ghost of Ellen's lavender soap that had seeped into the linen closet. The stove was down to embers, but it was still warm. I laid the creature on the rug by the stove, close enough to feel the heat, and tossed 2 oak logs onto the fire. The flames caught quickly, crackling and throwing orange light across the floorboards. In that light, the creature's chest began to rise and fall a little more steadily. It blinked slowly, looking at the fire, looking at me. I warmed some water in a pot, brought a clean rag, and knelt at a safe distance. Its whole body tensed. It wasn't aggression, it was expectation, as if it were waiting for pain, because pain was usually what hands brought. I paused and showed it the rag, let it feel the steam from the water. "Easy," I whispered, and then I washed the grime from its arm. It winced. I cleaned a shallow gash clogged with dirt and bound it with a strip torn from an old sheet.
I wasn't gentle the way Ellen would have been, but I was steady, and steady is what frightened things need. I poured warm milk into a mug and set it on the floor so it could reach without moving much. Drink if you want, no one's taking it away. It looked at the mug, then at me, then it picked it up with both hands and began to drink, carefully, as if trying to make no sound out of habit. I sat back on my heels and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The house creaked and settled. The fire made its soft, living noise. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a long sigh. The creature finished the milk and held the mug as if it were something of great value. Then it looked toward the dark hallway at the rest of the house. It didn't know the word home, but it knew sanctuary. It knew the boundary. This room, I told it, you stay here, in the warm, in the quiet. It didn't understand the words, not then, but it understood my voice. It understood that I wasn't pushing it back out into the dark. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the yard. The yard was empty. The road beyond it was dark, no headlights. The stable was a low shadow against the woods, and at the edge of those woods, so far back that I could have blamed it on tired eyes, I saw a figure, tall, motionless, not a tree, not a fence post, something alive, standing straight, waiting in the darkness. It didn't approach, it didn't make a sound, it just watched the house, as if counting the breaths inside. My fingers gripped the curtain until the fabric groaned. Behind me, the creature made a tiny sound, no louder than a breath, and when I turned, it was looking at me with that same wide, intelligent gaze, as if it knew that I knew. In that moment, a simple thought settled in me, heavy as a stone. This was no accident. Someone had brought it here, left it where a man could find it, where there was heat, light, and a chance at life. I nodded once, not to whoever was outside, but to the situation itself, like a man accepting a load he'd been handed. "All right," I said quietly, "we'll do this right." I barely slept that night. I sat in Ellen's old chair with a blanket over my knees, listening to the quiet sounds of another living body in my house. The creature dozed in short bursts, waking now and then to check if I was still there. Every time it opened its eyes, I stayed still, and I kept my face calm. Toward dawn, as the sky began to pale, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. My spine stiffened. Headlights swung through the trees on the road. Too early for the mail truck.
The engine sounded more powerful than most local rigs. The creature sat up in one sudden movement, alert as a deer. I held up a hand, palm down. Stay. Quiet. It looked at my hand, then my face, and then slowly lowered itself back onto the rug, eyes fixed on the window. The truck slowed at my gate. For a few seconds, the headlights flooded the yard, the stable, the porch. It was as if the driver were looking for something, or as if they had heard a story and wanted to see if that story lived here. Then the truck moved on, not turning in, and the sound faded into the distance. Only when it was gone did I realize I had been holding my breath. I went to the door and turned the lock, something I hadn't done in years. Ellen used to laugh at me for leaving it open. Then I looked back at the rug, at the small figure curled near the heat, and my mind finally gave shape to the fear I'd been avoiding. If someone saw him, it wouldn't stay a harmless fable. Men with questions would come, men with cameras, men with guns, men who believe the world belongs to them just because they can name everything and claim it for themselves. I knelt by the creature again. It watched me, still wary but calmer now, the fire painting warm highlights on its matted fur. "I don't know what you are," I said, because honesty mattered. "But I know what you aren't. You aren't game to be hunted." The creature didn't answer, of course. It couldn't, not then. But it reached out, slowly, cautiously, and touched the cuff of my sleeve with two fingers, as if to check to see if I was real. The touch was light, barely there, and yet it was the first time in 3 years I had felt needed. I stood up, went to the stove, and placed a chipped enamel bowl of water on the hearth where the warmth would find it. That was the first night. That was the beginning of my secret. And as the morning light began to bleed into the kitchen, thin and gray, my empty house, though as quiet as ever, began, just slightly, to breathe again. In the beginning, I told myself it was temporary. That's the lie a man uses when he's doing something he knows he shouldn't. Temporary keeps your hands steady. Temporary lets you sleep. Temporary makes a problem feel like weather, something that passes through whether you deserve it or not. But the first week turned into a month, and the months stacked up like split oak along my back wall, and one morning I realized I'd stopped thinking of my house as empty. He stayed close to the stove at first, on the rug I dragged out of the hall closet, the one Ellen used to complain about because it shed little threads like a bad sweater. I set a folded quilt beside it, Ellen's quilt, a patchwork thing made from worn shirts and feed sack cotton. I didn't tell myself why I chose that one. I just did, like my hands knew something my mind was still catching up to. He slept in short bursts, light and watchful, waking at every creak of the house. The first time the refrigerator kicked on, he jerked upright like he'd been grabbed. His eyes went wide, his whole body went tight, ready to run, even though he didn't know where running would take him. I remember letting my own breath out slow on purpose, lowering my shoulders, showing him calm the way you show a skittish horse you're not a threat. "Easy," I said, "easy." He watched my shoulders, watched my hands. Then, slowly, he did the same. The first rule I learned was simple. He hated surprises, so I stopped moving fast. I started clearing my throat before I entered the room. I knocked on my own kitchen door frame like I was a polite guest in a stranger's house. I kept the curtains drawn at night. I left the porch light off. I moved through my own place like someone who didn't want to wake the homeowner. The second rule took longer. He didn't trust the hallway. That dark corridor leading to the bedrooms made him uneasy. He'd stand at the edge of it, sniffing the air like there was a predator living back there. Maybe there was. Grief can live in a place if you let it. I didn't push him. I slept in my chair by the stove for a while, blanket over my knees, because it felt wrong to leave him alone in a room he didn't fully trust. He watched me the way you watch somebody who's teaching you the shape of the world. His gaze wasn't blank, it was working. He tracked everything, how I turned the kettle, where I kept the flour, how I opened a window just a crack when smoke got too thick. He noticed patterns. When I sat, he sat. When I stood, he stood. Not for fun, for survival. On the fourth day, he reached toward my mug, not grabbing, asking. I slid it closer. He lifted it with both hands and sniffed. Coffee was too bitter for him. His face tightened and he pushed it away like he'd been insulted. A laugh jumped out of me before I could stop it, short and dusty, like a cough that had forgotten it could be joy. He flinched at the sound, then studied my mouth. After a moment, he made a soft grunt, half question, and the corners of his mouth pulled up a fraction, as if he was tasting what a smile might feel like. That was the first time I thought, you're not just frightened, you're curious. I started with gestures because they were honest. Palm down meant stay, finger to lips meant quiet, a slow point to the rug meant there. I used the same motions every time until he stopped hesitating and started responding. When he understood, he didn't just obey, he looked at my face afterwards, searching for confirmation, like a child learning to read an adult's approval. He needed names. Everything living needs names. Names are how you pull a thing close without touching it. So I named the simple things first. I held up the tin cup. Cup. I tapped the stove.
fire. I touched my chest. Tomas. He repeated nothing at first. He only watched and listened, mouth slightly open like he was tasting the sounds.
The engine sounded more powerful than most local rigs. The creature sat up in one sudden movement, alert as a deer. I held up a hand, palm down. Stay. Quiet. It looked at my hand, then my face, and then slowly lowered itself back onto the rug, eyes fixed on the window. The truck slowed at my gate. For a few seconds, the headlights flooded the yard, the stable, the porch. It was as if the driver were looking for something, or as if they had heard a story and wanted to see if that story lived here. Then the truck moved on, not turning in, and the sound faded into the distance. Only when it was gone did I realize I had been holding my breath. I went to the door and turned the lock, something I hadn't done in years. Ellen used to laugh at me for leaving it open. Then I looked back at the rug, at the small figure curled near the heat, and my mind finally gave shape to the fear I'd been avoiding. If someone saw him, it wouldn't stay a harmless fable. Men with questions would come, men with cameras, men with guns, men who believe the world belongs to them just because they can name everything and claim it for themselves. I knelt by the creature again. It watched me, still wary but calmer now, the fire painting warm highlights on its matted fur. "I don't know what you are," I said, because honesty mattered. "But I know what you aren't. You aren't game to be hunted." The creature didn't answer, of course. It couldn't, not then. But it reached out, slowly, cautiously, and touched the cuff of my sleeve with 2 fingers, as if to check to see if I was real. The touch was light, barely there, and yet it was the first time in 3 years I had felt needed. I stood up, went to the stove, and placed a chipped enamel bowl of water on the hearth where the warmth would find it. That was the first night. That was the beginning of my secret. And as the morning light began to bleed into the kitchen, thin and gray, my empty house, though as quiet as ever, began, just slightly, to breathe again. In the beginning, I told myself it was temporary. That's the lie a man uses when he's doing something he knows he shouldn't. Temporary keeps your hands steady. Temporary lets you sleep. Temporary makes a problem feel like weather, something that passes through whether you deserve it or not. But the first week turned into a month, and the months stacked up like split oak along my back wall, and one morning I realized I'd stopped thinking of my house as empty. He stayed close to the stove at first, on the rug I dragged out of the hall closet, the one Ellen used to complain about because it shed little threads like a bad sweater. I set a folded quilt beside it, Ellen's quilt, a patchwork thing made from worn shirts and feed sack cotton. I didn't tell myself why I chose that one. I just did, like my hands knew something my mind was still catching up to. He slept in short bursts, light and watchful, waking at every creak of the house. The first time the refrigerator kicked on, he jerked upright like he'd been grabbed. His eyes went wide, his whole body went tight, ready to run, even though he didn't know where running would take him. I remember letting my own breath out slow on purpose, lowering my shoulders, showing him calm the way you show a skittish horse you're not a threat. "Easy," I said, "easy." He watched my shoulders, watched my hands. Then, slowly, he did the same. The first rule I learned was simple. He hated surprises, so I stopped moving fast. I started clearing my throat before I entered the room. I knocked on my own kitchen door frame like I was a polite guest in a stranger's house. I kept the curtains drawn at night. I left the porch light off. I moved through my own place like someone who didn't want to wake the homeowner. The second rule took longer. He didn't trust the hallway. That dark corridor leading to the bedrooms made him uneasy. He'd stand at the edge of it, sniffing the air like there was a predator living back there.
Maybe there was. Grief can live in a place if you let it. I didn't push him. I slept in my chair by the stove for a while, blanket over my knees, because it felt wrong to leave him alone in a room he didn't fully trust. He watched me the way you watch somebody who's teaching you the shape of the world. His gaze wasn't blank, it was working. He tracked everything: how I turned the kettle, where I kept the flour, how I opened a window just a crack when smoke got too thick. He noticed patterns. When I sat, he sat. When I stood, he stood. Not for fun, for survival. On the fourth day, he reached toward my mug, not grabbing, asking. I slid it closer. He lifted it with both hands and sniffed. Coffee was too bitter for him. His face tightened and he pushed it away like he'd been insulted. A laugh jumped out of me before I could stop it, short and dusty, like a cough that had forgotten it could be joy. He flinched at the sound, then studied my mouth. After a moment, he made a soft grunt, half question, and the corners of his mouth pulled up a fraction, as if he was tasting what a smile might feel like. That was the first time I thought, you're not just frightened, you're curious. I started with gestures because they were honest. Palm down meant stay. Finger to lips meant quiet. A slow point to the rug meant there. I used the same motions every time until he stopped hesitating and started responding. When he understood, he didn't just obey. He looked at my face afterwards, searching for confirmation, like a child learning to read an adult's approval. He needed names. Everything living needs names. Names are how you pull a thing close without touching it. So I named the simple things first. I held up the tin cup, cup. I tapped the stove, fire. I touched my chest, Tomas. He repeated nothing at first. He only watched and listened, mouth slightly open like he was tasting the sounds.
A week later, when I set warm milk down, he looked at the mug, then at me, and made a sound that wasn't quite the word, but wasn't nothing either. Muh, he said, like the shape of the sound didn't fit his mouth yet. I froze with my hand still on the counter. That's right, I said, softer than I meant to. Milk. He tried again, meh, then muh, working the sound like a man working a stiff hinge. After that, learning came the way spring comes, slow, stubborn, and impossible to stop once it started. I found an old box of children's books in the attic. Ellen had kept them because she never threw away things that once mattered. Picture books with big letters, simple stories, the kind I never would have bought, but there they were, waiting. I set one on the floor. He approached like it might bite. He sniffed the pages, then ran 2 fingers over a picture of an apple, as if feeling for texture that wasn't there. Apple, I said, and pointed to the real bowl of apples on the counter. His eyes moved from paper to fruit and back again. Something clicked behind them. He made a low sound, almost satisfied, like a gate finally lining up with its latch. Reading became our evening ritual. I sat at the table under the yellow lamp Ellen used to leave on so the kitchen didn't feel like a cave. He sat on the floor near the stove, back against the cabinet, warmth climbing into him. I read slowly, not because I thought he needed slow, but because it gave us time to exist in the same room without rushing past each other. Outside, the farm stayed the same, fences to mend, troughs to fill, hay to cut. But inside, the days started to carry a second heartbeat. He helped without being asked once he understood what help was. The first time, I was wrestling a feed sack onto my shoulder, my back complaining the way it does when you've lived too many years. I grunted, shifted, tried again. Before I could get my feet set, a hand, broad, heavy, careful, took the sack from me and lifted it like it weighed nothing. He carried it to the bin and set it down gently,
like he understood what spilled grain meant when money had to stretch. I stood there with my arms empty, feeling useless and grateful at the same time. "Thank you," I said, "because manners aren't just for people." He watched my mouth, then he touched his chest once and made a sound that wasn't my word but carried the same weight, an answer. He learned systems, not tricks. He figured out the gate latch by watching twice. He learned which floorboards creaked and started stepping over them. He understood the rhythm of my chores, when I went to the barn, when I checked the fence line, when I sat down with my coffee and stared too long to nothing. More than once, I'd look up and find him watching me like he was taking inventory of my moods. I found myself talking to him in that plain, half-useful way men talk when they're alone too long. I named tools. I explained why you don't leave a wrench in the rain. I told him the weather was changing when my knee ached. I told him Ellen used to sing while she cooked, and that the silence afterward was like driving a long road with the radio dead. Most of it, I figured, meant nothing to him. Then came the night with the hairpin. Rain came hard, drumming on the roof like a fist. The kitchen smelled of wet wool and wood smoke. I was digging in the pantry for a jar of preserves and found behind it one of Ellen's hairpins, plain metal, tarnished, caught in the corner of the shelf where she must have dropped it and never bothered to retrieve it. It shouldn't have been enough to do anything to me. It was nothing. But grief doesn't measure. It waits. My throat closed. My hand shook. I sat down at the table without meaning to. The chair scraped, too loud in that quiet house. The first sob that came out of me sounded like a tool snapping. I pressed my fist against my mouth to keep the sound down, like there was still somebody in the bedroom who needed sleep. I felt him move before I saw him. By then I'd called him Moss, not because it was clever, but because it fit the way he had come into my life, quiet, green, softening the hard places without asking permission. He approached and stopped beside me, close enough that his warmth touched my shoulder, but not crowding me. He waited like he already learned that sometimes waiting is the only help you can give. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. My skin felt raw. "I'm sorry," I said, and I didn't know who I was saying it to. I'm sorry." He made a low sound, not a question, not a warning, just presence. I looked up at him, and for the first time I spoke like he could understand more than tone. "My wife, Ellen," I said, pointing down the hallway toward the bedroom, toward the part of the house I kept shut up inside me. "Gone." He followed my finger, then his gaze returned to my face, steady as fence wire. "She died," I said, no softer version, "and I didn't come back from it, not all the way."
My voice cracked. I stared at the table because the table was safe. It didn't look back. "You showed up," I went on, words spilling out like water finding a crack. "You showed up in my barn, like you knew where to go, and I don't know why you were there, and I don't know what you are, but you made me get up again. You made me light the stove for someone besides myself." A small laugh pushed through my tears, bitter and honest. "You made me talk." Moss lowered himself until he was crouched beside me. He reached out, hesitated, then laid his hand on my shoulder. Not a pat, not a squeeze, just weight, gentle and undeniable, like a blanket being placed over you when you didn't realize you were cold. He stayed there, breathing slow, and in that quiet, with rain hammering the roof and the fire breathing behind the stove door, my crying slowed the way a storm slows when it runs out of sky. After that night, something shifted. Ellen was still gone,
That didn't change, but grief stopped being a locked room. It became a thing I could carry without dropping everything else. Moss began to show preferences, and those preferences began to bend my days.
It happened with hunting. I wasn't a sport hunter. I hunted because that's how you fill a freezer when money matters. One morning, late in the season, I cleaned my rifle at the table like I always did. The oil smelled sharp. The metal was cold under my fingers. Moss watched from his spot by the stove. His face tightened, subtle, but there. His shoulders rose, not in fear, but in refusal. When I stood and reached for my coat, he moved between me and the door. I stopped, surprised. He touched the rifle with one finger, then drew that finger back like it burned. He shook his head once, slow. "Don't like it," I said. He made a stronger sound, and his eyes held mine with a steady insistence that didn't feel like stubbornness. It felt like principle. I could have pushed past him. I could have told myself that it was ridiculous to take moral direction from a creature the world insisted didn't exist. But I thought of the way he'd stayed when I cried. I thought of the calm he carried into the barn when the cows were frightened. I thought of how he lifted heavy things with care, not just strength. So I set the rifle back down. "All right," I said, and my throat tightened for a different reason. "All right, we'll do it different." I planted more, traded more, bought meat in town when I had to, keeping it wrapped and plain, and I stopped bringing blood into my yard. The farm didn't fall apart because of it. If anything, it steadied, like the land approved of less death. In the evenings, we read. His finger traced letters, his mouth shaped sounds. He learned my name clean before he learned anything else. "Tom," he said first, then later, careful and full, "Tomas." Sometimes when I paused too long at the hallway, he'd stand beside me and breathe slow until my shoulders dropped. He never said Ellen's name, but he didn't need to. He reminded me quietly that living was still allowed. We lived like that, careful, hidden, almost normal, longer than I thought we ever would. Then the outside world started to lean in. It began with small things. A neighbor at the feed store mentioned tracks near the creek, laughing as he said it, like laughter made it harmless. Somebody else talked about strange sounds in the timber at night, a scream that didn't match any animal they knew. A handwritten flyer appeared on the bulletin board by the register, asking for witnesses, unusual signs near the forest line. I pretended to laugh with them. I made the right noises. I paid for seed and oil and coffee and drove home with my hands steady on the steering wheel. But when I pulled into my driveway that day, Moss was already at the window, face half hidden by the curtain, body still as a fence post. He knew, the way animals know a storm is coming before the sky changes. That night, after I checked the barn latch and banked the coals and set the water on the hearth, I stepped onto the porch and heard something that didn't belong to farms or forests, a faint electronic chirp, the kind you hear when something with a battery wakes up and records. I stood there in the cold with it seeping into my boots, listening, and the hair along my neck rose one by one. Behind me in the doorway, Moss made a soft warning sound. He pressed his hand to his chest, then pointed toward the tree line. "New rule," his gesture said. "New danger." I went back inside, locked the door, and drew the curtains tight. Then I sat at the table under the yellow lamp and pulled a scrap of paper toward me. For the first time since I carried him from the barn to the fire, I wasn't making a plan for crops. I was making a plan to keep a living secret alive. Moss started breaking our rules the same way winter starts breaking a mild fall, quietly at first, then all at once. For years he'd lived by the pattern we built, curtains drawn after dusk,
No stepping onto the porch if a car passed on the road. No wandering near the creek where strangers like to fish. He'd come and gone in short, careful windows of time, always returning before the stove settled down to coals. Then he began to listen differently. He'd stand at the window with his head tilted, still as a post, and stay there long after I'd finished washing the dishes. He started leaving at night and returning later than he ever had, smelling of cold water and deep timber. In the mornings, I found signs where there hadn't been any before. 2 stones set side by side with a branch laid across them, like a crude marker. 3 long scratches high on the bark of a cedar. A line of pebbles leading toward the back pasture. He wasn't playing. Moss didn't do anything for play unless it had a purpose behind it. Those marks were language meant for someone other than me. I felt it in my gut the way I used to feel a storm in my knee. He was waiting for something, and the waiting made me uneasy, because waiting meant he believed the thing he wanted was close enough to hear him. The night it finally arrived, I heard the sound before I saw anything. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't an owl or the wind in the grass. It was lower than a man's voice, but shaped like speech. 2 long notes and a shorter one, carried clean through the trees. The hair rose on my arms, not from terror, but from recognition. This was not my world making noise. This was a different world speaking through it. Moss froze by the stove. His shoulders lifted. His eyes went to the back pasture like he could see through walls. Then he looked at me, not asking permission, not begging, just telling me it was time. I left the porch light off. I pulled on my coat and stepped outside into air sharp enough to make my teeth ache. The sky was clear. Stars hung like nails driven into black wood. The yard was a dark, flat shape bordered by the tree line, and everything felt paused, waiting for the next breath. Moss moved beside me, silent. He stopped at the edge of the yard, and I stopped with him, because I learned that when he stopped, it mattered. At first, the forest looked like it always did, trunks and shadow, branches stitched together overhead. Then the shadow shifted in a way that wasn't wind. A figure stepped out, then another, then another. They came slowly, cautiously, as if approaching someone else's property line. No charge, no threat, just presence. Tall, broad, covered in dark hair that swallowed starlight.
They stopped short of my yard, holding distance the way decent people do when they're arriving somewhere uninvited. Moss took 2 steps forward and stopped. He wasn't the trembling little thing I'd carried from my barn to my stove years ago. He was grown now, wide-shouldered, steady, sure of his body. But standing between me and them, he carried the same seriousness he'd always had, the look of someone trying to do something right. The biggest one stood slightly ahead, older, I could tell by the heaviness in his stance, by the way the others seemed to take their cue from him. To his left stood a female, smaller through the waist, but not by much, her head turning in quick checks that missed nothing. Behind them were 2 younger ones, one nearly grown and one still slight, half hidden behind the female's hip, like a shy kid peeking out from behind a mother's skirt. A family, a structure, not a lone monster from a story. Moss touched his chest and made a soft sound, then pointed toward me, then back to them. A bridge built out of gesture and trust. The older male's eyes found mine. They were dark and deep-set, not empty, not animal simple. There was intelligence there, but also restraint, the kind of restraint you see in an animal that has survived by knowing when not to show its teeth. In that moment, something settled in me, heavy and clean. Moss hadn't wandered into my barn by accident. He had been guided, placed,
left in the only way a desperate family can leave a child, where warmth might be found, where the wrong kind of human might not look too closely, where a broken man might still have enough decency left to carry someone to the fire instead of calling men with guns. Moss turned and looked at me, and the choice he'd been circling for weeks landed between us. I could give him back and return to my quiet, or I could accept what my life already was and protect not just him, but the world that had trusted me with him. I thought of the years after Ellen died, the hollow house, the days I survived only because chores don't care if you're grieving. I thought of the night I cried over her hairpin and Moss stayed beside me without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. Without him, I'd been alive, but I hadn't been living. If I handed him over just to reclaim silence, I knew what would happen. I'd die inside again. So I stepped forward, slow, hands visible, no sudden movements, and gave a small nod, the way a man nods when he's taking on a hard job without making a speech about it. "All right," I said quietly, "I'm here." Moss exhaled like he'd been holding air for years. The family didn't come closer that night. They didn't have to. The point wasn't to cross into my yard. The point was to show me the truth. Moss belonged to something bigger than my kitchen and my stove, and now I belonged to the edge of it too. Before they withdrew, the female shifted, and I saw why they'd come now. The smallest one limped, not dramatically, not crying, just careful, favoring a leg. Dark fur on its thigh was clumped and stiff, dried blood and mud matted together. Injured. Moss saw it and made the gesture I knew, hands together like folding cloth, then a point toward my house. Help. The next day, I gathered what I could without making it look like I was packing for a secret war. Soft food, applesauce, oatmeal, mashed potatoes, warm milk in a thermos, clean cloth, bandages, a small bottle of antiseptic I kept for wire cuts, 2 old wool blankets that still held a faint smell of cedar and Ellen's linen closet. At dusk, Moss led me past the back pasture into a shallow ravine where the air smelled damp and green, like ferns and stone. The light faded faster there. The family waited in the trees, present but not exposed, as if they understood the value of not startling someone who might be holding their child's safety in his hands. Moss set the thermos down first, then opened it himself, poured a little into his palm, and drank. He made a soft, approving sound and nudged it toward the female. She approached, sniffed, then drank cautiously, then more deeply. The smallest watched with a hunger that made my chest tighten. Moss crouched beside my supplies and demonstrated with slow patience, dipping cloth in warm water, dabbing his own forearm, then pointing to the injured leg. He was translating human care into their language of hands and intent. When the female allowed the smallest forward, I saw the wound clearly, a gash along the thigh, angry and swollen, a trap maybe, or a sharp rock. Either way, it was the kind of wound that can turn bad without help. I cleaned it gently. The smallest flinched hard, and the female made a low warning sound, stepping half a pace forward. The older male lifted one hand, calm, boundary, and made a short sound that settled her. Order, even in fear. Moss held the smallest steady, humming low in his chest, steadying it the way he had once been steadied by my stove's heat and my quiet presence. I wrapped the bandage snug but not tight and laid a wool blanket on the ground. The smallest lowered itself onto it with a long exhale, and I felt, absurdly, like I'd just fixed something inside myself, too. That was when Moss did something I didn't expect. He touched his chest, not the quick touch that meant me and our lessons, but a deliberate one, and made a sound, 2 syllables, low and rounded. He repeated it once, watching my face closely. This wasn't my name for him. This was his. I tried to shape it back carefully, like repeating a prayer you don't want to miss-say. Moss watched, then nodded once, small but final. Then he pointed to me. I touched my chest the same way. "Tomas," I said, and I said it like it mattered. Moss repeated it.
Not perfect, but close enough that my throat tightened. 2 names exchanged in cold forest air. Not magic, a quiet agreement. I see you, you see me. For a short time after that, things felt balanced. The smallest healed. It began to put weight on its leg again. Moss visited the family more often, then returned to my house with that calmer steadiness he carried after being among his own. And then the men came. Not the curious kind who laugh in a feed store and call it a joke. These men arrived with purpose and equipment. I found the first trail camera near my fence line, tucked low, aimed toward the tree line. A black plastic box with a lens like an unblinking eye. The next day I saw tire tracks on the shoulder where no local would bother pulling over. Then, on a morning I drove the back road under the excuse of checking a section of fence, I saw their camp in the timber. Neat tents, coolers, cases, a generator with fresh fuel cans, radios, and, half covered in tarp, a reinforced cage. Not for raccoons. My hands went cold. They weren't here to learn. They were here to take. That night, I drew it for Moss on my kitchen floor with a piece of charcoal. A box for the cage, little marks for men, a circle for cameras, a line toward the ravine. Moss watched, jaw tight, then made a slicing motion with his hand, like cutting a rope. Stop them. We didn't plan a battle. We planned to survive. We kept it simple. Buy time, bend attention, prevent violence. I did what I knew, what a farmer does when weather turns. I disrupted the systems that made them confident. I found their fuel stash and poured just enough into the dirt to make their generator unreliable. Not all, just enough to send them into endless troubleshooting. I left boot tracks where I wanted them to search, leading toward rocky ground that wouldn't hold a clear print. I broke branches in the wrong direction. I scattered old deer bones near a creek bend so their evidence pointed away from the ravine. Small, boring acts, the kind that don't look heroic, because they aren't. Moss and his family did their part without laying a hand on a man. At night, the timber around that camp pressed in. Heavy footsteps circled at a distance. Branches snapped high where no deer could reach. A low call rolled from one ridge and was answered from another, making the men understand this wasn't one creature they could corner. It was a community that knew the land better than any map. The men grew tired. Tired men make mistakes. They snapped at one another. They argued about false signals. Their radios crackled with interference. Their cameras went blank. Food vanished from coolers without a latch being broken. Not horror, just the slow disassembly of their confidence. After a week, the camp began to fold. Cases got loaded. Tents came down. The cage was hauled back onto a trailer like something shameful. When the last engine sound faded down the road, I stood on my porch and let the quiet return. Not the empty quiet of grief, but a quieter quiet that held more than one heartbeat. Near sunset, Moss led me to the fence line where pasture met trees. The family waited there, still keeping respectful distance. The older male stepped forward, holding something. He extended it toward me. It was my father's pocket watch. I'd lost it when I was 16, down by the creek, the day I slipped off a wet log and went into the water up to my chest. I'd searched for it until my fingers were numb, then lied to my father and said I must have left it in the barn.
I hadn't seen it in 40 years. The metal was scratched in the same place, the face was cracked, the hinge was stiff. It was unmistakable. My throat tightened. I took it with both hands, feeling the cold weight of time. The older male met my gaze, and I understood what he was telling me without words. They had known me longer than I'd known them. They had watched the kind of boy I was, the kind of man I became, measuring whether I was the sort who leaves the weak to die or carries them to warmth. I pressed my hand to my chest, the way Moss had taught me. I nodded once. Thanks. Yes, I understand. The female made a soft sound, acceptance more than affection, and the smallest, now standing solid on its heeled leg, leaned forward curiously. It didn't touch me. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. They withdrew slowly into the trees, the forest taking them back like a door closing without a slam. Moss stayed a moment longer. He looked at my house, then at the tree line, then back at me. His eyes held a decision that was his to make. He touched his chest and made his true name sound, quiet, steady, then touched my chest lightly with 2 fingers. Tomas, he said, as close as his mouth could manage. My chest tightened, but I kept my face calm. Go, I whispered. Go where you belong. He stepped backward into the trees, pausing once as if to make sure I wasn't changing my mind. Then the shadows took him. After that, life didn't become a legend. It became something better, something that fit. I kept farming. I kept mending fences. I got older one stiff joint at a time. The house stayed quiet, but it wasn't hollow anymore. Some nights, when the wind was right, a low call would drift from par timber, and my shoulders would loosen like a knot untying. Moss didn't live by my stove anymore. He wasn't mine to keep, but the bond didn't vanish when he left. It stayed in the way I moved through my days, slower, kinder, less eager to kill what I didn't need to kill. It stayed in the way the forest around my farm felt less like emptiness and more like neighborhood. And every night I still did the same 3 things. I checked the latch on the barn door. I banked the coals so they'd last till morning. And I set a chipped enamel bowl of water at the hearth where the warmth could find it. Not because I expected someone to come in out of the cold, but because once you've been chosen by something the world refuses to believe in, you don't go back to living like you're alone.